£3,000. That was the entire budget. In real money, something like $5,000 for a 39-minute film called The Hunt for Gollum, shot by a director nobody outside a fairly devoted corner of the internet had heard of, with a volunteer crew that numbered somewhere around 160 people, most of whom were paid in nothing but the pleasure of the thing. It came out in 2009. It premiered at a small science fiction festival in London, went up online a few days later, and has since quietly gathered more than 13 million views on a platform that, at the time, could barely manage a stable high-definition stream. For a decade and a half, nobody with any real power seemed to mind that it existed. And then, in the spring of 2024, a studio with considerably more than £3,000 to spend announced its own film, same exact title, word for word, The Hunt for Gollum. And for about a day, before somebody at Warner Brothers thought better of it, that tiny fan film got hit with a copyright takedown by the very people whose franchise it had been loyally, lovingly serving for 15 years. We will get back to that particular bit, corporate foot shooting, later tonight, because it is one of my favourite small stories in the whole business, and I do not want to rush it. But I bring it up first because it tells you something true about tonight's subject before we have even properly started, which is that the hunt for Gollum, in every sense of that phrase, is a story about scale, about a handful of pages in a book being asked to become 2 hours of studio filmmaking, about a 15-year-old fan project suddenly finding itself standing uncomfortably close to an $83 billion corporate transaction, about one small, wretched, murderous creature who has somehow become valuable enough that a major studio will fight to protect the rights to hunt him. So that is what we are doing tonight. 3 things, really, folded into one, because they refuse to stay separate once you start pulling at them. First, the actual canon, the real Tolkien material, the honestly quite short and quite dark sequence of events in which Aragorn, at Gandalf's urging, tracks down and captures the creature called Gollum somewhere in the dead marshes and drags him most of the way across Middle-earth. Second, the new film, the one directed by and starring Andy Serkis, due out in December of 2027, and everything that is actually confirmed about how it came to exist. And third, because the title of tonight's video did promise this and I intend to deliver on it, every theory currently circulating about what that film is actually going to contain, who its brand new characters really are, and what it means that a studio is spending what is presumably a very large amount of money turning 2 paragraphs of source material into a feature-length production. I should say plainly, the way I try to each time, that I will keep those 3 things separate as we go. There is settled book canon in tonight's script, and I will treat it as settled. There is confirmed, reported production fact about the new film, sourced from actual interviews and actual trade press, and I will treat that as fact, while still being honest that reporting can be wrong or incomplete. And then there is theory, rumour, fan, speculation, the stuff people have built up around casting announcements, and a handful of quotes from Philippa Boyens, and I will flag that as exactly what it is every single time it comes up. I find that distinction matters rather a lot with a subject like this one, because the internet has a way of letting confident speculation harden into remembered fact within about a week, and I would rather you fall asleep tonight with an accurate, if slightly fuzzy, picture in your head than a tidy but wrong one. There is no ranking tonight, no countdown, no big reveal saved for the end. I am not going to tell you the studio's plot twist, because nobody, as far as I can tell, actually knows it yet, least of all me. We will move roughly from the old story to the new one, from the book to the production history, to the cast, to the rumour mill, but nothing in one section depends on you having caught the section before it, and nothing builds to some grand, unified theory of what Andy Serkis is planning. Each part stands on its own, the way a shelf of small stories does. So if you drift off somewhere in the middle of the dead marshes, or somewhere around the corporate ownership history, you will not have missed a payoff, because there genuinely isn't one waiting for you. That is rather the whole design of these videos, and I mean it more sincerely than it probably sounds. Tonight is for keeping you company while your body does the actual work of falling asleep, not for testing your recall in the morning. If you like this sort of thing there is a subscribe button somewhere on the screen. No pressure either way. Honestly, that is the only time I will mention it tonight. Right, let us start with the part of this story that has been sitting quietly in the books since 1954, waiting for a film industry to eventually catch up to it. The character everyone in this story is hunting was not born Gollum. He was born Smaug, a store hobbit, one of the river-dwelling branch of hobbit kind that lived along the banks of the Gladden Fields, long before anyone in the Shire had heard of Bagginses or birthday parties. Gollum is a nickname, and a fairly unkind one at that, an onomatopoeic word for the horrible swallowing, gurgling noise he made in his throat once the creature had more or less replaced the hobbit. I mention this early because the film marketing and a great deal of casual conversation online tend to use Gollum as though it were a species or a proper name he was born with, and it simply is not. Tolkien is quite deliberate about this. Smaug is the name of a person. Gollum is what several hundred years of solitude and possession did to him, and it really is several hundred years, which is a detail I think gets flattened rather badly whenever this story gets summarised quickly. Smaug got hold of the ring around the year 2463 of the Third Age, and he did not find it lying on the riverbank, the way some tellings imply. His friend Daggle found it, having been dragged into the water by a fish he was trying to land. And when Daggle came up holding a gold ring, Smaug asked for it as a birthday present. When Daggle, entirely reasonably, said no, Smaug strangled him for it. That is the actual founding act of this whole story. A small, grubby, opportunistic murder between two hobbits who up until that afternoon had apparently been perfectly good friends. There is a small philological joke buried in their names that I rather like and that I do not think gets pointed out often enough. Smaug's name comes from an old English word, smegen, meaning to ponder or to investigate, to poke around in things. Daggle's name comes from a related Old English word meaning secret or hidden. So you have, quite literally by name, the inquisitive one murdering the secretive one for the thing he was trying to keep hidden. I don't know that Tolkien expected many readers to go digging for that, given how thoroughly buried in Old English philology it is. But once you notice it, you cannot really stop noticing it. From 2463 to 2941, for something on the close order of 478 years, Smaug possessed the ring continuously, alone, underground, beneath the Misty Mountains. I want to be careful with that number, because it is very easy to say 478 years, the way you would say 4.5 years, as a passing phrase, and completely miss what it is doing narratively. Frodo carries the ring for a matter of months, and it very nearly breaks him. Bilbo carries it for 60 years, and comes out the other side unusually well, all things considered, though not unscathed. Smaug carries it for the better part of 5 centuries, alone in the dark, eating raw fish and the occasional careless goblin he could get his hands around in a tunnel, and the wreckage that leaves him in by the time Bilbo stumbles into his cave is not really comparable to what happens to anyone else who ever holds the ring. His corrosion is a special case, built on an entirely different timescale, and I think it is worth dwelling on that difference for a moment before we move on, because so much of what follows, including quite a lot of the sympathy the books extend to him, only makes sense once you take that span of time seriously. Bilbo takes the ring from him, unknowingly, in the riddle game Beneath the Mountain, in that same year, the events that became The Hobbit. We will come back to that riddle game later tonight, because there is a genuinely strange piece of publishing history tangled up in exactly how that scene was originally written, and it deserves its own space, rather than a rushed mention here. For now, the important thing is simply that Gollum loses the ring and spends the rest of his miserable existence looking for it, first inside the mountain and eventually, drawn by rumour and by something like a compulsion, wandering out toward Mordor itself, roughly a decade later, right around when Sauron openly declares himself and begins rebuilding his tower. 50 years pass in the world above ground, more or less undisturbed, while Gollum wanders. Bilbo has his long-expected party turns 111 and disappears from the Shire, leaving the ring behind for his young cousin Frodo in the year 3001. Gandalf's suspicion about that ring is not immediate. It builds slowly, over years, the way any responsible person's suspicion about something genuinely dangerous tends to build, rather than arriving all at once in a flash of certainty. By around 3009, Gandalf is anxious enough that he starts actively searching for Gollum himself, hoping that finding him will help confirm or deny what he already suspects about Bilbo's old ring. And it is around this point that he brings in Aragorn. I want to pause on Aragorn for a second, because the new film's marketing, understandably, wants you to think of this as a young ranger's origin story, and the books really do not support that reading. By the time Gandalf enlists his help hunting Gollum, Aragorn is already chieftain of the Nadain, already going by Strider in the Wilds, and in Bree, already a hardened, weathered man in what would read, to a human observer who didn't know better, as early middle age, who was born roughly 7 years before these events, and while memory and blood gives him a far longer lifespan than an ordinary man, this is not some fresh-faced newcomer stepping into his first real quest. He has been doing this kind of grim, thankless work for decades already. The new film is reported to bring in a different actor for the role, with Viggo Mortensen's involvement unclear, and I will talk properly about that casting news a little later, but I wanted to plant this flag now, early, while we are still inside the actual book chronology. Whatever version of Aragorn the new film gives us, canon insists he should already feel like a man who has spent a long time being tired in exactly this particular way. Gandalf and Aragorn search for years without success. Wilderlin is enormous, and Gollum, whatever else you want to say about him, is genuinely good at not being found. And here is the detail I think the marketing around the new film tends to quietly skip past, and it is honestly the single most important thing to understand about this whole story, before anyone gets to Aragorn's part in it. Gollum is not simply hunted and eventually cornered by the good guys. He is caught first, by the other side, sometime around 3017, by the dating in Appendix B. Sauron's own forces capture Gollum somewhere near the Dead Marshes and drag him into Mordor, into Barad Dûr itself, where he is tortured and interrogated. Under that torture, Gollum gives up 2 words: Shire, Baggins. That is what breaks out of him. Just those 2 words, without the address of Bag End or the name Frodo to go with them, which is precisely why, later, the Nazgul have to search an entire region rather than riding directly to a front door. And then, and this is the part I find genuinely chilling once you actually sit with it, Sauron does not kill him. He lets him go. Deliberately, the theory, laid out by Tolkien himself in the essay The Hunt for the Ring, is that Sauron released Gollum specifically hoping he would lead searchers, agents, anyone, back toward wherever the ring had ended up. Gollum becomes bait, a tracking device with a pulse, set loose into the wild on the assumption that his obsession would eventually walk him, and whoever was following him, straight to the prize. So when Aragorn finally does catch up with Gollum, on the 1st of February, 3018, finding him lurking at nightfall by a stagnant pool in the Dead Marshes, peering into the water the way he always does, Aragorn has no idea that he is not actually the first hunter to have found this creature. He does not know Gollum has already been inside Barad Dûr. He does not know exactly what Gollum gave up under torture. He is, in a very real sense, cleaning up after damage that has already been done, racing a clock whose starting point he cannot see. I think that reframes the entire chase rather significantly. The popular shorthand is Aragorn hunts Gollum. Full stop. Hero corners villain. The actual shape of the story is considerably darker and considerably more urgent than that. Sauron already knows 2 words that matter enormously. Aragorn is trying to contain a leak that has already sprung. What follows the capture is, by Aragorn's own account later, at the Council of Elrond, one of the worst experiences of his very long life. He marches Gollum something like 900 miles over roughly 50 days, deliberately choosing the hardest, most roundabout route he can manage, avoiding both Moria and the Gap of Rohan specifically, to close off any opportunity for rescue or for Gollum to slip away along a more populated road. He delivers his prisoner to King Thranduil in the woodland realm of Mirkwood on the 21st of March, 3018, which means that grim, exhausting trek very nearly matches, almost to the week, the actual gap of about 7 weeks that separates those two historically dated points. Aragorn himself calls it, in his own words at the council, the most weary of all his journeys. And given the sort of life Aragorn has led by that point, wandering as a hidden ranger for decades, that is not a small claim. Thranduil takes custody of Gollum, and here is where I think the story does something quietly against expectation. You would assume an ancient elven king, holding the creature responsible, even indirectly, for so much danger, would treat him harshly. Instead, by Legolas's own account at that same council, the elves treat Gollum with more patience and more decency than he arguably deserves. He is guarded closely, yes, kept a prisoner, yes, but he is also, at times, allowed up into a tree under watch, simply to get fresh air. It is a small, almost tender detail, sitting inside a very grim sequence of events, and Tolkien includes it, I think, quite deliberately, to make what happens next land harder. On the 20th of June, 3018, orcs out of Dol Guldur attack the woodland realm directly. Thranduil's forces win the battle in purely military terms, but in the chaos, Gollum's guards are overwhelmed, and Gollum escapes. Legolas is explicit, recounting this to the council, that this was no lucky accident on Gollum's part, and no simple security failure on the elves' part. The strong implication, sitting right there in the text, is that Sauron orchestrated the entire assault for the specific purpose of springing one prisoner, which means that somewhere in Mordor, someone decided that a single wretched, half-mad creature was valuable enough to justify attacking an entire elven kingdom to retrieve him. That is not a small commitment of resources for one asset. It tells you, more clearly than almost anything else in this story, exactly how much weight Sauron placed on what Gollum knew, and on what Gollum might yet lead his forces toward. And it is Legolas himself who rides to Rivendell to deliver that news, which is, incidentally, the actual concrete reason he is present at the council in the first place, rather than some vague sense that an elf ought to be in the room. He is there because he is the messenger carrying word of an escape that his own people failed, through no real fault of their own, to prevent. Gandalf, hearing this, redoubles his urgency about getting the ring, and Frodo out of the Shire as quickly as possible, because Gollum, who knows those two words, Shire and Baggins, is now loose again, and very possibly being tracked by the enemy's own agents. By September of that same year, the Black Riders begin their search of the Shire in earnest, and Frodo departs Bag End, and this is more or less exactly where the source material for tonight's subject runs out, and the main events of the Fellowship of the Ring properly begin. I will say, before we move off the book material entirely, that the dating I have just given you, the 1st of February and the 21st of March and the 20th of June, all in 3018, comes from a fairly careful attempt by later scholars to reconcile two sources that do not, strictly speaking, agree with each other. Appendix B, The Tale of Years, gives one set of implied dates. That same essay, printed later in Unfinished Tales, gives dates that shift the capture into 3018 rather than 3017 for some of the events. Christopher Tolkien, editing his father's papers, notes plainly that the two accounts are slightly at variance with each other and does not pretend to resolve it cleanly. I like that this is one of the very few places in the Legendarium where an actual contradiction survives in Tolkien's own hand, acknowledged by his own son, rather than papered over. It is not a fan error. It is not an adaptation getting something wrong. It is simply Tolkien working across decades on an enormous body of material, leaving a small seam showing. I find that oddly comforting, honestly. The idea that even the person who built this entire world could not always keep every date perfectly aligned in his own head. Now, you have been counting along. You will have noticed something about the length of everything I have just told you. The whole of it. From Smaugall strangling his friend by a riverbank to Legolas riding into Rivendell with bad news is drawn from a truly small amount of text. Two fairly short paragraphs tucked into the chapter called The Shadow of the Past, Aragorn's own brief retelling before the assembled council, a handful of terse entries in the Tale of Years appendix, and that one unfinished essay, printed only in the third part of a supplementary volume most casual readers never open at all. Which brings us to the actual production this whole video is hung on, and to the question that I suspect has been sitting underneath everything so far for anyone who has read those source pages. How exactly do you stretch that into something like 2 hours of film? The honest answer, as far as anyone outside the production actually knows, is that you invent a great deal, and the people making this film have not been especially cagey about saying so, which I think is worth crediting them for, even if it complicates the marketing a little. Philippa Boyens, who co-wrote every one of the original trilogy screenplays and every Hobbit screenplay alongside Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh, and who is producing and co-writing this one too, reportedly gave an interview that is, by my reckoning, still the single clearest statement of where this story actually sits. She placed it plainly in the gap Tolkien left open after Bilbo's long-expected birthday party and before the Fellowship reaches the Mines of Moria, which, if you were doing the arithmetic along with me a moment ago, covers roughly the 17 years in which Gandalf grows suspicious, searches, enlists Aragorn, and everything else we just walked through happens. Boyens described the resulting story as, in her words, quite an intense story, an adventure story, with a really strong psychological interior story going on as well. I think that phrase, psychological interior story, is doing a huge amount of work, and it is worth remembering as we go, because it recurs, almost word for word, in nearly everyone else's description of this project too. Andy Serkis, who both directs and once again performs Gollum through motion capture, described the film's position a little more evocatively, saying it sits absolutely between the Hobbit trilogy and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and that it amounts to a deep talk about the psychology and history of Gollum before he became Gollum, alongside what he called a very burning question from Gandalf about the potential origin of the ring itself. Note, in passing, that last clause, Gandalf's own uncertainty about what the ring actually is, sits right alongside the Gollum material chronologically, which tracks with the book, where Gandalf's suspicion and his hunt for Gollum develop more or less in parallel, though it is worth flagging, since we are being careful about this tonight, that the ring's ultimate confirmation as the One Ring comes from an entirely separate thread in Tolkien's own story, Gandalf reading Isildur's old scroll in the archives of Minas Tirith, and later testing the ring in Frodo's own fireplace. The Gollum material corroborates and adds urgency to that discovery. It is not, in the books, the proof itself. Peter Jackson, for his part, is on record explaining why he chose not to direct this one himself, despite having directed every previous live-action entry in this franchise, going back to 2001. His reasoning, as reported from remarks at Cannes in 2026, is refreshingly specific, rather than diplomatically vague. It is an internal story about Gollum's psychology and addiction, he said. It's a personal story to Gollum, and he knows this guy better than anybody, which is, I think, a really gracious thing for a director of Jackson's stature to say about handing over a franchise he built almost from nothing, and it is hard to argue with the logic. Serkis has now been living inside this specific character, on and off, for roughly a quarter of a century. Nobody else on the planet has that particular relationship with him. Jackson apparently went further than that single soundbite in his Cannes remarks, according to coverage from several outlets that were in the room. He talked about what draws him to Gollum as a character in the first place, describing the split at the heart of the creature, the worst of human nature embodied in Gollum proper, sitting right alongside something honestly sympathetic and salvageable in Smauggle, the Hobbit underneath. That split, according to Jackson, is the actual engine of this new film's psychology-first approach. Not plot, not spectacle, but that internal argument the creature is constantly having with himself, dramatised, presumably, at a scale the two trilogies never had room for. Since in the original films, Gollum is mostly a supporting, if unforgettable, presence, rather than the entire subject. Serkis and the producers have also, somewhat unexpectedly for a Tolkien production, cited Joker, the 2019 film, as a tonal reference point. I find this an interesting choice to dwell on for a moment, because it is not the kind of comparison a Tolkien adaptation usually reaches for. The idea, as reported, is using an established, enormous shared universe as the backdrop for a tight, bottled character study, one built around psychology and addiction rather than around plot mechanics or spectacle set pieces. Whether that comparison holds up once the actual film exists is obviously not something I can tell you tonight, but as a stated intention, it tells you something real about what the people making this are aiming for, which is presumably closer to a character piece wearing Middle-earth scenery than a conventional action-adventure filling in a gap in the timeline. Serkis has also said, and I think this matters given how much of the online conversation around this film worries about it leaning too heavily on modern digital tools, that it will absolutely be made the way the original trilogy was made, meaning practical New Zealand production values rather than a radically different pipeline. He is on record saying the production could shoot him directly on actual outdoor mountain locations in New Zealand rather than recreating those landscapes digitally afterward, which, if true in practice, and not just in interview, would put this film's Gollum performance closer in spirit to 2002 and to a fully synthetic modern blockbuster. We will come back to exactly how his motion capture work is being handled, and to a rather charming story about where his voice for the character actually came from a little later tonight, because that material earns a proper telling of its own later, rather than being folded in here. Now, there is one piece of confusion around this project that actually was floating around for a while, and it is worth clearing up properly, rather than leaving it as background noise, because I suspect some of you have heard a garbled version of it. For a stretch of time, rumour held that Hunt for Gollum itself was quietly being split into two films, the way some studios have taken a single book and stretched it into a duology, purely for commercial reasons. This idea seems to have picked up steam after Ian McKellen made public comments that appeared to suggest his commitment to playing Gandalf again might span two separate live-action productions. Fans, reasonably enough, given how the industry usually behaves, assumed that meant Hunt for Gollum was itself being cut in half. Philippa Boyens shut this down directly in that same interview I mentioned a moment ago, and her actual explanation is more interesting than the rumour it corrects. I can tell you definitively it isn't two films, she said. That was a genuine misunderstanding that happened, because we've begun to work, conceptually, on two different live-action films. So Hunt for Gollum really is one film, but sitting alongside it, in early conceptual development, is a second, entirely separate, live-action Lord of the Rings project, also involving this same producing team, and very likely involving McKellen's Gandalf again, given his comments. That second film later picked up a rather surprising detail of its own. Stephen Colbert, yes, the American late-night host, who's been a well-documented, lifelong, extremely serious Tolkien enthusiast for decades now, was confirmed to be co-writing this second, still largely unannounced film, alongside Boyens and a writer named Peter McGee. What that second film is actually about, whether it is a sequel to something, a prequel to something, or an entirely parallel story set somewhere else in the timeline, has not been specified anywhere I could find. It is, at this point, close to a complete blank, one film title, with essentially no content attached to it yet. I only mention it here because I think it is a plainly fun, under-discussed footnote, and because it explains, cleanly, a rumour that otherwise sounds like it came from nowhere. Now, since a psychology-first story built out of 2 paragraphs still needs an actual cast of people to carry it, let us talk about who is actually in this thing, and about the small industry of theories that has grown up around several of them. The returning cast is, on paper, about as reassuring as this sort of project could hope for. Ian McKellen comes back as Gandalf. Elijah Wood comes back as Frodo Baggins, even though Frodo's role in this particular window of the story is necessarily a quiet, early one, since the main events here happen years before he ever leaves Bag End. Lee Pace returns as Thranduil, which makes a great deal of sense given how much of the second half of the book material we just walked through happens inside his own kingdom. And Andy Serkis, obviously, returns as Gollum, both performing him again through motion capture and directing the entire production. A role reversal that is, on its own, one of the more unusual things about this whole project. The recasting of Aragorn is the returning role that has stirred the loudest conversation, and understandably so. Viggo Mortensen does not appear in this film at all, and Jamie Dornan has been cast as the younger version of the character instead. I want to be precise here, because a certain amount of feud narrative has attached itself to this recasting online, the sort of thing that spreads, because it is more dramatic than the truth. As far as the reporting I could find goes, there is no actual rift here. Andy Serkis has specifically said, on the record, that Mortensen is thrilled about Dornan taking on the role, given that the character has to be considerably younger in this timeline, 17 years or so before the trilogy most audiences know. Recasting, rather than attempting an extended de-aging effect on Mortensen himself, seems, at minimum, like a defensible, creative choice, whatever you make of the execution, once you actually see it. There was also, before Dornan's casting was confirmed, a fairly loud fan campaign pushing for Henry Cavill to take the role instead, popular enough that when he was passed over, it generated its own small wave of online disappointment. I mention it mostly as a reminder of how much unofficial casting theorising happens around a project like this, well before anything is confirmed. Pattern that, as we are about to see, has not slowed down at all now that the actual cast list exists, because the far more interesting casting news, and the part that has generated the bulk of the actual fan theorising I promised you at the top, involves the entirely new characters. There are 3 of them, as far as anyone has confirmed. Kate Winslet has been cast as a character called Marigold. Anya Taylor-Joy has been cast as a character called Seren, described in reporting as a lethal Sindar elf loyal to Thranduil. And Leo Woodall has been cast as a character called Halvard, described as a fellow Dinadane ranger who joins Aragorn on the hunt. I want to say this plainly and clearly, because it is the load-bearing fact of this whole section of tonight's video. All 3 of these characters are confirmed, entirely invented for this film. None of them exist anywhere in Tolkien's actual writing, not in the novel, the appendices, unfinished tales, or any letter or draft that has ever been published. Marigold, Seren, and Halvard are new inventions, full stop, which means that a meaningful percentage of the named cast in this supposedly faithful Tolkien adaptation is walking around playing people who simply did not exist in the source material at all. That has not, predictably, stopped fans from trying to retrofit them into the existing lore, and honestly, I understand the impulse, because Tolkien's world is dense enough and interconnected enough that it is a properly fun puzzle to attempt, even when the studio itself has given you no actual basis for solving it. Take Marigold first. The theory attached to Kate Winslet's character, based mostly on the shape of her name and some paraphrased press description, rather than any direct studio confirmation, holds that she is meant to be Smaugol's grandmother. This one is worth pausing on for a moment, because it is not a theory built from nothing. The books do actually mention Smaugol's grandmother, in passing, as the matriarchal head of his extended Stoor Hobbit family, the elder who eventually turns him out of the family whole entirely, once his behaviour, the spying, the stealing, the general cursing under his breath, becomes too much for the household to tolerate. That is, in the text, the direct precipitating event that sends him wandering off toward the Misty Mountains in the first place. Years before he ever finds the cave, he will spend the next several centuries inside. So a grandmother figure is frankly present in Tolkien's account of Smaugol's early life, unnamed and undeveloped on the page, exactly the kind of gap a screenwriter looking for dramatic material would be drawn to. Whether Kate Winslet's Marigold is actually meant to be that same grandmother, dramatised properly for the first time, is, again, theorised rather than confirmed. But I will say, it is a theory with real bones in it, unlike some of the others we are about to get to. There is also a smaller, rather charming piece of real-world trivia sitting behind this casting that has nothing to do with the character herself. Winslet reportedly turned down a role in the original trilogy back when it was being cast at the turn of the millennium, and is only now, more than 2 decades later, finally joining this particular corner of the franchise. I find that a truly nice bit of symmetry, an actor circling back to a project she once passed on, even if the role she eventually accepted is not one Tolkien ever actually wrote. Then there is Seren, Anya Taylor-Joy's character, the lethal Sindar elf described as loyal to Thranduil. The theory here is considerably more speculative, and entertainment outlets covering it have been fairly careful, from what I can see, to present it as one fan idea among several rather than as anything leaked or confirmed. The theory holds that Seren might secretly be Arwen, Elrond's daughter, operating under a placeholder or disguised name, for reasons the theory itself does not really specify. I am somewhat sceptical of this one, if you want my honest reading, mostly because Arwen already exists as a named, well-established character in this exact era of the timeline, and there is no obvious storytelling reason to hide her identity behind an invented name, rather than simply casting her as Arwen outright, where the original trilogy did with Liv Tyler. There is, though, a small etymological detail worth knowing, regardless of whether the Arwen theory holds up. Seren is an actual, real Welsh word, meaning star, which would sit comfortably alongside Tolkien's own habits of grounding his invented Elvish naming conventions in real-world Celtic-influenced philology. The production has not confirmed that this is the intended meaning behind the name, so I would not build too much on it, but it is at least a plausible, tasteful choice, if that is indeed where the name came from, rather than an arbitrary string of vaguely Elvish-sounding syllables. And then Halvard, Leo Woodall's character, the fellow Nadain ranger who joins Aragorn on the hunt. This one has generated noticeably less theorising than the other two, mostly, I suspect, because there is less obvious lore to hang a theory on. He appears to simply be an original character, a companion figure, invented to give Aragorn someone to talk to and work alongside across what the books describe as a long, gruelling, mostly solitary trek. Woodall himself, speaking to press about the role, described joining a Lord of the Rings production as something like a boyhood dream, which I find a rather sweet, uncomplicated thing for an actor to say about a role that is, structurally speaking, mostly there to keep Aragorn from spending 90 minutes talking to nobody but a prisoner. I think the honest way to hold all three of these characters in your head, at least until the film actually exists and gives us something more concrete to work with, is this. They are new. They are confirmed new. And the theories fans have built around them, the grandmother, the secret Arwen, whatever, eventually gets proposed about Halvard, are really fun ways of engaging with a very Tolkien-shaped puzzle, but they remain puzzles the studio has not actually handed us the pieces for. I would enjoy them the way I enjoy any good piece of speculation, lightly, without getting too attached to being right. You have started drifting somewhere around Halvard and his boyhood dream. That is completely fine, by the way. Nothing that follows depends on you having caught that part cleanly. This is roughly the point in one of these videos where I expect a good portion of you to be somewhere between half asleep and gone entirely. And honestly, that was rather the idea. For those still with me though, I want to go back and press a little harder on something I mentioned earlier, because I think it deserves more than the one paragraph I gave it the first time around. The fact that Sauron's own forces caught Gollum before Aragorn ever did is, to my mind, the detail that reframes this entire story. And it is also, I think, the thing the new film's marketing is least likely to lead with, simply because Aragorn hunts, Gollum makes for a cleaner poster, and Sauron already broke him and let him go on purpose. Think about what that actually means for the shape of a 2-hour film built around psychology and interior struggle. If the producers do choose to dramatise that torture and interrogation directly, rather than leaving it as backstory Aragorn or Gandalf recounts secondhand, you are looking at a rather dark sequence. Gollum, already centuries deep into his own private ruin, broken further inside the actual seat of Sauron's power, giving up the 2 words that will eventually cost him everything. Entertainment press has floated the idea that the Nazgul themselves might appear on screen, doing some or all of that interrogation, since the Ringwraiths are the obvious agents Sauron would use for this kind of work, and it is a theory I find plausible on pure dramatic logic. But I want to be honest with you that it is exactly that, a theory built on plausibility, not a confirmed plot beat from any producer statement I could actually find. Nobody making this film has said on the record that we will see the Nazgul question Gollum directly. It would fit. It has not been promised. What I can tell you with more confidence is that this is precisely the kind of material the producers keep gesturing toward when they use that phrase, psychological interior story, over and over in interviews. And it turns out that framing is not new to this production at all. People have been reading Gollum this way, as a genuine psychological case, rather than simply a monster, for a very long time, in some fairly unexpected places. Tolkien himself, in a letter numbered 246 in his published correspondence, laid out what he considered the actual moral and theological hinge of the entire legendarium, and it runs directly through Gollum. Bilbo's exercise of patience and mercy towards Gollum. He wrote, gained him mercy. His failure was redressed. That is Tolkien's own explanation for why Bilbo's small, almost throwaway act of pity, sparing Gollum's life back in the tunnels, under the misty mountains, rather than killing him, when he had every opportunity, and arguably every reason to, ends up mattering more than almost anything else that happens across the entire trilogy. Frodo inherits that mercy, extends it further, and it is that same chain of pity, stretching from Bilbo through Frodo, that ultimately saves the whole quest at Mount Doom, when Gollum, of all creatures, ends up being the one whose presence determines how the story actually ends. In that same letter, Tolkien goes further and calls a different moment the single most tragic point in the whole book. Not Boromir's death, not anything that happens at the Black Gate. He points instead to the stairs of Cirith Ungol, the scene where Sam, exhausted and understandably suspicious, wakes at the wrong moment and misreads what is, by Tolkien's own account, a genuine flicker of near repentance in Gollum, fleeting moment where Smaug might almost have turned back from what he becomes. Sam's harsh word in that instant, entirely understandable given everything Sam has watched Gollum do, closes the door. Tolkien calls that the tragic heart of the book, not a battle, not a death, but a small human failure to recognise mercy being offered back the other way. I bring this up here because it tells you something the studio's own language keeps circling without quite landing on directly. It has never really been a monster story. Scholars and clinicians, entirely independent of any film production, have spent decades treating Gollum as something closer to a genuine case study. In 2004, the British Medical Journal published a short, unusually earnest paper titled A Precious Case from Middle-earth, written by medical students at University College London under academic supervision. They diagnosed Gollum formally, as though he were a real patient, concluding he displayed most of the standard diagnostic criteria for schizoid personality disorder, and wrote the whole thing up with the straight-faced rigour of an actual clinical case file for a patient who was centuries old. It is a rather funny artefact to stumble across, a serious medical journal solemnly diagnosing a fictional hobbit, but underneath the joke of it sits something real, which is that Gollum's presentation, the isolation, the split sense of self, the compulsive fixation, maps unusually well onto recognised clinical patterns. Other writers, looking at the same evidence, have reached for different labels entirely. Some point towards straightforward schizophrenia. Others suggest something closer to dissociative identity disorder, the condition once more commonly called multiple personality disorder, though several later analysts have specifically pushed back on that particular diagnosis, arguing it does not quite fit, since real dissociative identity typically involves alters who are not mutually aware of each other, whereas Smaug and Gollum, whatever else is happening between them, always seem to know the other one is there, arguing back. None of these diagnoses agree with each other, which I find rather fitting for a character built, in Tolkien's own telling, out of an unresolved argument between two names for the same person. And it is worth remembering, whenever the new film's marketing leans on words like psychological and interior, that it is not inventing a new lens for this character, so much as finally putting a camera directly on a reading that has existed in various forms since long before Andy Serkis ever put on a motion capture suit. Now, let us shift entirely away from psychology and theology and towards something a good deal more mundane, though I promise it is more interesting than it sounds. Who, exactly, owns the right to make any of this at all? Because the honest answer is that the path from Tolkien's writing desk to a 2-hour Andy Serkis character study has been considerably longer and stranger than the story it eventually produces, and it repays walking through, partly because it explains why this film exists now, in 2027, rather than at some other point in the last 60 years. Tolkien himself sold the film rights to his Middle-earth, writing back in 1968, to United Artists, while he was still alive, though he did not live to see any of it come to screen. United Artists sold those rights in 1976 to a producer named Sol Zaentz, and it was Zaentz's ownership that eventually produced Ralph Bakshi's animated Lord of the Rings in 1978, a film we will actually come back to a little later tonight, for reasons that have nothing to do with rights law and everything to do with a very specific piece of trivia about who first played Gollum on screen. Zaentz held on to those rights for more than 2 decades, and it was Zaentz's company that licensed them to New Line Cinema in 1998, the deal that eventually let Peter Jackson make the trilogy most of us actually grew up on. That licensing arrangement, running from New Line through the original trilogy, and later through the Hobbit films, held for a long time, but licenses are not the same as ownership, and eventually it needed renewing or replacing. That is where the story gets plainly modern. In August of 2022, a Swedish gaming conglomerate called Embracer Group bought Middle-earth Enterprises outright, the entire science rights package, for a reported $395 million. This is the same underlying company, just under new corporate ownership, that had licensed the original trilogy decades earlier, and Embracer did not stay quiet about its intentions. In its own public statements at the time, the company said explicitly that it planned to explore additional movies based on iconic characters such as Gandalf, Aragorn, Gollum, Galadriel, and Owen, naming Gollum specifically as a character worth building something around, more than a full year before Hunt for Gollum was ever formally announced, which tells you this was not some spontaneous creative spark from Jackson's team. It was, at least in part, a rights holder identifying a marketable gap and going looking for someone to fill it. Warner Brothers Discovery's own chief executive, David Zaslav, confirmed during a fourth quarter 2022 earnings call in February of 2023 that New Line had struck a new long-term deal with Embracer's Middle-earth Enterprises for more Lord of the Rings films, a renewal that had become necessary because the original licensing arrangement had lapsed. The Hunt for Gollum project itself got a provisional, titleless announcement sometime in 2023 and only actually received its working title, the one we now know as The Finished Thing, when Zaslav confirmed it by name on the 9th of May 2024, alongside mention of that second, still unnamed, live-action film we talked about earlier. At that initial announcement, the target release was reported as 2026. It later slipped to the end of 2027, which is the date currently on the calendar. And given how much film production schedules tend to move around in general, I would not be shocked if you are hearing this video sometime after that date has itself shifted again, one way or the other. And then, in May of 2026, the ownership structure shifted once more, in a way I suspect very few casual fans of this franchise are aware of. Embracer spun off its entire Tolkien and gaming intellectual property portfolio into a brand new company, separately listed on the Nasdaq Stockholm exchange, called Fellowship Entertainment. That company, not Embracer directly anymore, is now the literal corporate parent of Middle-earth Enterprises, meaning the actual legal owner of the right to make any new Lord of the Rings film at all is, as of this recording, a publicly traded Swedish company that did not exist under that name before 2026. I find that a properly strange thing to dwell on, a piece of pure high fantasy escapism whose real-world custodianship runs through Stockholm Stock Exchange filings rather than anything resembling Middle-earth itself. None of this, by the way, is the first time money and Tolkien's estate have collided uncomfortably. Back in February of 2008, Tolkien's heirs sued New Line Cinema directly, alleging that the studio had paid the Tolkien Trust only $62,500 up front against a promised 7.5% of the gross receipts on a trilogy that had, by that point, earned something in the neighbourhood of $6 billion across tickets, home video, and merchandise. That is not a rounding error. That is a lawsuit serious enough that it frankly threatened to prevent The Hobbit from ever being greenlit at all. Since no studio wants to expand a franchise, it is actively being sued over by the rights holder's own family. It was eventually settled out of court the following year for an amount reported at somewhere above $100 million. And that settlement is, quite directly, the reason every Hobbit film and every post-Hobbit Lord of the Rings project, Hunt for Gollum very much included, was legally able to get made at all. It is a strange thing to think about, that this particular character, study about a hobbit talking to himself in the dark, exists, structurally, on top of a courtroom settlement about unpaid royalties from a completely different film released years earlier. And the corporate weather around this film has not calmed down even now, right at the point of production. On the 5th of December, 2025, Netflix announced an $83 billion acquisition of Warner Brothers Discovery streaming and studio businesses. The deal structured so that Warner Brothers Discovery's cable and television networks would spin off into a separate standalone company, while Netflix absorbed the actual studio operations, New Line Cinema included, which is to say, Hunt for Gollum's own distributor. That deal did not go uncontested. Paramount Skydance launched a competing, all-cash offer to acquire Warner Brothers Discovery outright, reportedly worth around $30 a share, and Warner Brothers Discovery's board unanimously rejected that offer, reaffirming the Netflix deal as the one it considered to be in shareholders' best interest. As of when this research was gathered, the regulatory approval process for that Netflix acquisition was still ongoing, which means there is a real, live possibility that the company actually releasing this film into theatres will not be the same corporate entity that greenlit it. I want to be careful to separate two things here, because it would be very easy to blur them together into something scarier than it actually is. This corporate reshuffling does not touch who owns the Tolkien intellectual property itself. That still sits with Fellowship Entertainment, the Embracer spin-off, licensed out to New Line under the existing deal. What might change? The Netflix acquisition closes as proposed is simply which larger media company owns New Line, and therefore which company's name sits at the top of the marketing for a film that, by every account we have, is still being made in a deliberately old-fashioned, practical New Zealand way. It is a strange sort of stability and instability sitting right on top of each other, an unusually traditional production process wrapped inside an unusually unsettled corporate ownership picture. And I think that tension is truly one of the more surprising things about this whole project, once you actually go looking at how it came to exist. Which brings us back, finally, to that little 39-minute fan film I opened tonight's video with, because I promised I would return to it properly, and I think it deserves a fuller telling than the 2 sentences I gave it at the start. The film was directed by a British filmmaker named Chris Bouchard, and it premiered at the Sci-Fi London Film Festival before going up online on the 3rd of May, 2009. I gave you the budget and the volunteer crew size earlier, so I will not repeat those numbers again, but I do want to tell you something about how it managed to exist at all without ever running into legal trouble across all those years, because that part is really interesting. Bouchard told the BBC, around the time of its release, that his production team had reached an understanding with the rights holder at the time, then a company called Tolkien Enterprises, that the film would be tolerated as long as it stayed strictly non-commercial. No one was making money off it. No one was pretending it was official. It was, by design, a gift rather than a product. and the rights holder to its credit. Let it exist on exactly those terms. And it worked. For 15 years, the film steadily built up its audience, past 10 million views, and eventually past 13 million, entirely on the strength of word of mouth among Tolkien fans who had simply heard that somebody had made a rather decent, low-budget version of this exact story, long before any studio thought to. And then, the very same week, Warner Brothers formally announced its own official film under the identical title. In May of 2024, somebody at the studio filed a copyright takedown claim against Bouchard's 15-year-old fan project. I do not think I need spend much time explaining why fans reacted badly to that. The studio, having just announced it was finally making the story a beloved, scrappy, non-commercial fan film, had already told for free 15 years earlier, moved almost immediately to erase that earlier version from public view, using the exact same title as its own justification. It read, to a great many people online, as fairly naked corporate overreach, the kind of move that makes a studio look small, even while it is spending what is presumably an enormous budget on its own version. To Warner Brothers' credit, and this is the part of the story I find actually worth holding on to, they did not dig in. The takedown was reversed within roughly a day of the backlash building, restoring the fan film to public view, and it remains up, viewable right alongside the official production's own marketing push. To this day, it is, as far as corporate mistakes go, an unusually fast and unusually gracious about face, and fans still bring the whole episode up, periodically, as something close to a goodwill case study. A rare example of a studio actually listening and correcting course within about 24 hours, rather than letting lawyers grind the thing out for months. There is one more small detail about that fan film I like quite a lot, and it ties, in a roundabout way, back to the question of who might score the official production. The fan film's own soundtrack was composed by two people, Adam Langston and Andrew Scraby Tennis, and it was explicitly built on themes drawn from Howard Shore's original trilogy scores and from Clint Mansell's work elsewhere, which means, in a strange, unofficial, entirely uncredited sense, Howard Shore's musical fingerprints were already woven into a film called The Hunt for Gollum years before anyone could say, with any certainty, whether the real Howard Shore would ever be involved in the official one. And on that note, I do want to flag something clearly, because it has been circulating fairly widely, and I would rather you hear it from me with the correct level of uncertainty attached than pick it up second-hand as settled fact. A rumour began spreading in mid-August of 2026 that Howard Shore would indeed return to score the official film. As of the latest research I have, that rumour has not been confirmed by Warner Brothers, by New Line, by the producers, or by Shore himself. It may well turn out to be true. It has simply not been confirmed, and that distinction is one to hold gently, rather than letting a socially spread rumour gradually become the thing you remember as fact by the time this film actually comes out. Here is a detail that I think gets underappreciated whenever people talk about Andy Serkis and Gollum, which is exactly how much of the character was built out of, frankly, rather unglamorous personal observation, and how much of that same process is apparently being repeated decades later for this new film. Serkis has told the story of Gollum's voice enough times in enough interviews that it has more or less become settled anecdote at this point, and I still find it charming every time I hear it. He has said the sound came, in part, from watching his own cat cough up a hairball, a particular hack that travels the entire length of an animal's body from head to tail. He took that physical, involuntary, faintly disgusting sound and grafted it onto a voice placement built around a constricted throat, something he arrived at by thinking, deliberately, like an addict, a person whose body is fighting itself over something it cannot let go of. It is, when you actually linger on it, a rather brilliant piece of physical actors' research, taking something as mundane as a cat clearing its throat and turning it into one of the most instantly recognisable voices in modern film. The physical side of the performance went further than the voice alone. During production of the original trilogy, Serkis reportedly spent hours walking around on all fours, in character, between takes, and even offset entirely, to the point where he occasionally startled ordinary members of the public who had no idea a famous actor was crawling past them on his hands and feet. By his own account, running into a stranger mid-crawl sometimes forced him to improvise something in character on the spot, rather than simply breaking it and standing up, at one point apparently muttering something along the lines of, "I was just looking for something," staying in Gollum's voice, rather than dropping out of it to explain himself. I find that a rather funny image to hold on to. A serious actor committed enough to his craft that being caught crawling through a public space by a confused stranger becomes, instead of an embarrassment, one more improvised beat in a performance that never technically stopped. The technology built around that performance changed dramatically even within the original trilogy itself, which is a detail that tends to get lost once people think of Gollum as one consistent, finished creation across all three films. Between The Fellowship of the Ring, where Gollum appears only in a couple of brief shots, and The Two Towers, where his role expanded into something close to a lead performance, the entire computer-generated model was rebuilt from scratch. The earlier version used a modelling technique called NURBS. The rebuilt version switched to something called subdivision surface modelling instead, specifically so the digital face could be tuned more closely to resemble Serkis's own actual features. Once the production realised how much weight his performance was going to carry going forward, the team credited with that redesign is worth naming properly, because this kind of behind-the-scenes craft work rarely gets remembered alongside the performance it enables. Peter Jackson himself, the effects supervisor Richard Taylor, Christian Rivers, the illustrator Alan Lee, and an artist named Jamie Beswick all worked on rebuilding Gollum's face into something that could actually carry a full character across two more films. And for all of that, for originating a performance capture technique that fundamentally reshaped how visual effects work across the entire industry afterward, later used for Caesar in the rebooted Planet of the Apes films, and for Thanos in the Marvel films, among a great many others. Andy Serkis has never once been nominated for an acting Oscar. Not for Gollum, not for any of his later performance capture roles either. This is not simply an oversight or a matter of taste on the Academy's part. At the time these films were made, the Academy's own rules explicitly excluded performances filtered through computer-generated imagery from consideration in the acting categories at all. It was a structural, written policy barrier, not a case of voters simply preferring someone else. Peter Jackson himself apparently believed the performance should have qualified regardless, publicly comparing Serkis's work to John Hurt's performance in The Elephant Man, a role that earned Hurt a Best Actor nomination, despite being almost entirely hidden under heavy prosthetic makeup. The comparison is a fair one to raise. Prosthetics and performance capture both obscure an actor's face, while still transmitting a fully realised performance underneath. But the Academy never formally reconciled that tension, and no explicit rule change was ever made to accommodate performance capture acting specifically. The industry did, eventually, find one way to acknowledge what Waiter Digital's team had built. Joe Lettery and the wider Waiter Research Group received an Academy Scientific and Technical Achievement Award, a real and prestigious honour for the subsurface scattering skin rendering technique developed specifically to make Gollum's face read as believably alive on screen. It is simply not a competitive acting award, and the question of how or whether to credit performance capture acting properly has never really gone away since, resurfacing again with Serkis's later Caesar performances and remaining, by every sign I can find, entirely unresolved industry-wide even now. Let me zoom out for a moment on all of this, because Serkis's Gollum was never actually the very first time this character appeared on screen, even though it is the version almost everyone thinks of first. That honour belongs to Ralph Bakshi's animated Lord of the Rings, released in 1978, 24 years before Serkis ever put on a motion capture suit. Bakshi's film used a technique called rotoscoping, where live action footage, shot on location in Spain, was traced frame by frame directly onto animation cells to produce a moving, somewhat uncanny hybrid of live performance and hand-drawn animation. The actor who physically performed Gollum for that rotoscope footage was a man named Felix Siller, and if that name means nothing to you, I promise you have almost certainly seen his work somewhere else entirely, because Siller is far better remembered today for two completely different roles, playing Cousin It in the original Addams Family and playing the small robot Twicky in Buck Rogers in the 25th century. It is a strange little thread to pull on that the very first performer ever to embody this particular character went on to be best known as a sentient pile of hair and a chirping robot sidekick. But that is more or less how character actor careers in that era tended to work. One memorable, heavily disguised role leading, without fuss, into the next. And even Circus's own celebrated performance has never really existed in just one language, which I think is a nice, slightly overlooked way to close out this part of tonight's video. The German dub of the trilogy, voiced by Andreas Furlich, who by some accounts also had a hand in directing the German voice work, is often held up by fans as a serious piece of vocal acting in its own right, distinct from and in conversation with Circus's original English performance, rather than simply a technical translation of it. The Italian dub, performed by Francesco Vairano, has reportedly drawn similar attention from enthusiasts interested in how dubbing actors build a fully independent performance around someone else's already iconic work. It is a reminder, I think, that a character this vivid ends up being rebuilt, voice by voice, in dozens of languages around the world, each one its own small act of performance, largely invisible to anyone who only ever hears the English original. Here is a piece of publishing history I promised I would come back to earlier, when we were talking about Bilbo winning the ring off Gollum in the riddle game, Under the Mountain, because it is one of the strangest, and I think most unobtrusively admirable, things Tolkien ever did to his own work. You go back and read the very first published edition of The Hobbit, from 1937, the riddle game scene reads completely differently to the version most people know today. In that original text, Gollum is not a villain at all in that moment. He plainly intends to give Bilbo the ring as a fair prize for winning the riddle contest, and when he cannot actually produce it, having lost track of it himself, he apologises and personally shows Bilbo the way out of the tunnels, rather than attacking him. It is a fundamentally different Gollum, a strange, sad, but basically honourable creature, playing by the rules of his own game. The problem, of course, is that by the time Tolkien had finished writing the sequel, more than a decade later, the ring needed to be something far more sinister than a fairly won riddle prize, an object of genuine, corrupting evil, rather than a game token. And Gollum needed to be a creature who would never have handed it over willingly, under any circumstances. Most writers, faced with that kind of contradiction between an already published book and the sequel they actually wanted to write, would simply revise the earlier text gently and hope nobody noticed, or would write around the discrepancy and let it sit there unexplained. Tolkien did something considerably more interesting when he revised The Hobbit for its 1951 second edition, changing Gollum's behaviour in the riddle game to match the more sinister, murderous character the new book now required. He did not simply overwrite the earlier version and move on. He wrote the discrepancy directly into the new book's own prologue, explaining that the 1937 version, the one already sitting on readers' shelves, was in fact a lie, not an authorial error, a lie Bilbo himself told, to Gandalf and to the dwarves, under the ring's own corrupting influence. The Hobbit already being subtly warped by the thing he was carrying, shading his own account of how he acquired it into something gentler and more flattering than what actually happened. The real version, the harsher, truer one, where Gollum never intended to give up the ring at all, only comes out later, once the ring's true nature is understood, and Bilbo's small self-serving deception can finally be seen for what it was. I find that a properly remarkable piece of authorial craft, maybe my favourite single piece of trivia in Tolkien's whole body of work, honestly. He did not just fix a continuity problem, he turned the act of fixing it into a piece of in-universe characterisation, using his own revision as evidence of exactly the kind of quiet, self-serving corruption the ring causes even in someone as fundamentally decent as Bilbo Baggins. It might be the cleanest example anywhere in the legendarium of an author retconning himself, and then, rather than hiding the seam, building a small monument directly on top of it. There is a related piece of cut material from the film side of things that never made it to screen at all, in either version, and I think it belongs here because it is built on the exact same underlying idea of Gollum as a kind of warning, a preview of what the ring does to anyone who keeps it too long. Planned scene for the Two Towers would have given Faramir an actual vision, while deciding whether to let Frodo and Sam continue on their way. Frodo transformed into something Gollum-like, wasted, wretched, consumed by the ring, the same way Sméagol had been consumed centuries earlier. The idea, presumably, was to give Faramir's decision to release them a stronger, more visually concrete motivation. A direct glimpse of the fate Frodo was walking toward, the ring were allowed to keep working on him. Jackson cut the scene entirely, and unlike a fair amount of other material trimmed from the theatrical cuts, it never resurfaced, even in the extended editions. Unlike, for instance, the surviving flashback explaining why Boromir originally travelled to Rivendell in the first place, which was shot around the same time and did make it into the longer home video cut. It is a small, permanently lost piece of the production. One more version of the same idea we have been circling most of tonight, that Gollum's fate is never really presented as separate from Frodo's own, but as the darkest possible version of exactly where Frodo is headed, if mercy and willpower do not eventually intervene. That idea of Gollum as a kind of cautionary mirror has taken on a life of its own well outside Tolkien's scholarship, in a way I do not think Tolkien himself ever specifically intended, though it is worth noting he was famously resistant to allegory as a mode of writing generally, preferring what he called applicability, meaning readers finding their own resonance in a story, rather than the author encoding one fixed lesson into it. Gollum, specifically, has become a go-to literary example in popular and even some clinical writing around addiction, his physical wasting, his obsessive fixation on one single object above food, safety, or relationship, and the split we already talked about between Sméagol and Gollum as competing versions of the same person all get reached for repeatedly by writers trying to explain, in accessible terms, how addiction reshapes a person's behaviour and self-image over time. Tolkien did not build the ring as a metaphor for any specific substance, and I would be wary of overstating a reading he never endorsed in his own writing. But it is, by a wide margin, one of the most durable lenses anyone has put on this character, and it lines up, more or less exactly, with the producer's own repeated description of the new film as a psychological, interior story built around addiction. Whether that is coincidence or simply the obvious reading of the material finally getting its due on screen, I frankly could not tell you. I want to close this part of tonight's video on one more piece of real-world context, because I think it deepens rather than distracts from everything we have just talked about. Tolkien served as a battalion signalling officer at the Battle of the Somme in 1916 and lost two of his closest friends in that war, men he had known since school. In a letter written in December of 1960 to a correspondent named L.W. Forster, Tolkien confirmed directly, in his own words, that the dead marshes and the approaches to the Black Gate, the exact landscape Gollum leads Frodo and Sam through later in the story, owe something to northern France after the Battle of the Somme. That is not a scholarly inference built up from careful reading. That is the author himself, decades later, naming his own real-world source. Some scholars, working from that same well-documented biography, have gone further and argued that Frodo's lingering suffering after the quest ends, the wounds that never fully heal, the inability to simply return to ordinary Shire life the way Sam and Merry and Pippin more or less managed to, reads as a period-accurate depiction of shell shock, the term used at the time for what we would now recognise as post-traumatic stress. I think that context matters enormously for how seriously this whole story treats psychological damage, Gollum's included, rather than flattening it into simple villainy. A man who had personally walked through that landscape and lost friends in it, was never likely to write a monster story about what obsession and trauma do to a person. He was, I suspect, writing something considerably closer to observed fact, dressed in the clothes of fantasy. If you have gone under somewhere in the last little while, that really is fine, and I mean that every time I say it. There is nothing coming up that needs to be caught in sequence. So, let us talk about money for a bit, and about exactly how much pressure is unhurriedly sitting on this particular film before a single frame of it has reached an actual cinema. Take the latest entry in this franchise before Hunt for Gollum, because I think it explains a great deal about why this new film matters so much to the people financing it. The War of the Rohirrim, the anime prequel film released in 2024, set the lowest domestic opening weekend and the lowest overall domestic box office total of any film in the entire Peter Jackson produced Lord of the Rings franchise, against a reported budget of around $30 million, eventually grossing something in the neighbourhood of $20 million worldwide in total. I want to hold on to that figure for a second, because a film grossing less worldwide than its own production budget is about as clear a commercial disappointment as a studio can have. An entertainment press at the time was fairly blunt about reading it as a genuine warning sign, evidence that expanding this particular franchise beyond the core trilogy was not, on its own, a guaranteed commercial success. Compare that against the numbers the original trilogy actually put up. Released across 2001, 2002, and 2003, those three films grossed a combined $2.995 billion worldwide on a combined production budget of $281 million, and swept up 17 Academy Awards from 30 total nominations across the three films. A truly staggering ratio of prestige to spend by any Hollywood standard, then or now. The Hobbit trilogy, released a decade later across 2012 to 2014, cost considerably more to make, over $700 million combined, and while its worldwide gross came in only around $60 million below the original trilogy's total, that is a noticeably worse ratio of cost to return once you actually run the numbers side by side, and it fed years of industry conversation about diminishing returns the further this franchise got stretched beyond its original three films. Hunt for Gollum arrives 13 years after the previous mainline theatrical entry, The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, in 2014, which is by a wide margin the longest gap between theatrical releases in this franchise's entire history. All of which is to say, whatever else this film is trying to be, a psychological character study, a showcase for Serkis as director, a test of whether audiences still want more of this world at all, it is also carrying a really significant amount of financial pressure to prove that expanding this particular universe onto movie screens still works, after the latest attempt to do exactly that landed about as softly as a Middle-earth film ever has. There is one more piece of structural context worth clearing up here, because it is an unusually common point of confusion, and it deserves a direct, simple answer rather than being left implied. A lot of people, reasonably, wonder whether this new film connects in any way to Amazon's Rings of Power television series that has been running since 2022 and covers, in its own, much earlier corner of the timeline, some of the same broader world. It does not, and it structurally cannot, and the reason is entirely legal rather than creative. Warner Brothers and New Line hold the film rights to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Hobbit material. Amazon holds the separate television rights, an entirely different license, and the same underlying rights holder, Middle-earth Enterprises. Those are two completely distinct legal arrangements, and because of that split, Amazon's series cannot reference or connect to Jackson's film continuity in any binding way, and Warner Brothers' Hunt for Gollum has, in turn, zero legal or narrative connection to the Rings of Power television continuity. They exist as parallel, entirely walled-off adaptations of overlapping source material, not as pieces of one shared cinematic universe, the way, say, Marvel's films and television shows are increasingly built to interlock. If you ever find yourself wondering whether some detail from one might eventually explain or connect to something in the other, the honest answer baked into the actual rights architecture underneath both productions, is that it simply cannot. No matter how tempting the overlap in era and setting might make that connection feel. Right, one more section, and then I will let the two of us drift toward whatever is actually waiting at the end of tonight, which is not much, just a bit of closing and then quiet. I mentioned earlier that Philippa Boyens confirmed a second, entirely separate live-action Lord of the Rings film is in early conceptual development, co-written by Boyens alongside Stephen Colbert and Peter McGee. I want to come back to it one final time, not to repeat what I already told you about how it exists, but to be honest with you about exactly how little anyone actually knows about what it contains. As of everything I could find researching tonight's video, there is no confirmed subject, no confirmed time frame, no confirmed relationship to Hunt for Gollum at all, beyond the fact that the same producing team is apparently developing both projects at roughly the same time. Could be set decades before this story, could pick up sometime after it. It could sit somewhere else in Middle-earth's history entirely, following characters we have not even discussed tonight. It is actually an almost total blank, a single confirmed title that even has one yet, attached to essentially no content. I find that kind of total narrative uncertainty a little bit restful, honestly, in a way that a fully spoiled plot never is. There is nothing here for me to accidentally get wrong or overstate, because nobody involved has said enough yet for anyone to get it wrong. And the corporate wildcard I walked you through earlier, the Netflix acquisition of Warner Brothers Discovery's studio operations, remains exactly that, a wildcard, unresolved at the time this research was gathered. I do not think it changes anything about what you are actually going to see on screen when it finally arrives, since the creative team, the cast, and the intended tone all appear to be locked in, regardless of which company's logo ends up on the poster. But it is a rather unusual thing for a major franchise film to be sailing toward release while its own distributor's corporate ownership is still, functionally, up in the air, and it bears remembering the next time you see a trailer for this thing and it says Warner Brothers at the top, because by the time you're actually sitting in a cinema for it, that name might not be entirely accurate anymore. So, having walked through all of that, I want to spend a moment doing something I do not usually do in one of these videos, which is actually weighing the theories against each other, honestly, rather than just laying them all out with equal weight and moving on, because I do think some of them hold up better than others, and I would rather tell you what I actually believe than pretend I have no opinion at all. The Marigold as grandmother theory, to my mind, is the strongest of the bunch, simply because it is not built from nothing. The books plainly do gesture at an unnamed grandmother figure who plays a real, if brief, causal role in Smeagol's exile from his family, and giving her a face and an actor of Kate Winslet's calibre is exactly the kind of gap a screenwriter looking to add dramatic weight to an already dark backstory would be drawn toward filling. It fits the shape of the story Tolkien already sketched, even if the specific name and the specific casting are entirely new. The Seren, the secretly Arwen theory, by contrast, strikes me as considerably weaker, mostly because Arwen already exists in this exact stretch of the timeline as a named, established character, and hiding her under an invented Sindarin-sounding name creates a mystery the story does not obviously need, when simply casting an actress as Arwen directly would achieve the same dramatic function with none of the manufactured intrigue. I would hold that one loosely, if at all. And the theory that the Nazgul might interrogate Gollum directly on screen sits somewhere comfortably in the middle for me, properly plausible, given everything we know about the source material and the story's own dark, psychological framing, but entirely unconfirmed by anyone actually making the film, which means it remains, for now, exactly what I promised you at the outset, a theory and nothing more. But I think the more interesting thing to notice, once you step back from adjudicating any individual theory, is what all of this fan speculation is actually doing, structurally. And it is not really so different from what Tolkien himself was doing when he left those 2 paragraphs in the shadow of the past in the first place, or when he wrote an entire unfinished essay trying to nail down exactly how Aragorn's hunt lined up in time with events happening elsewhere. Tolkien built a world with deliberate gaps in it, unnamed grandmothers, undated skirmishes, characters mentioned once and never followed up on, and he seems to have understood, even as he was writing it, that those gaps were not failures of completeness so much as invitations. Readers have been filling them in essays and appendices, and now increasingly in fan theories about a Kate Winslet casting announcement for the better part of 70 years. The theories currently circulating about Marigold, about Seren, about what happens inside Barad Doctor are not really a new or strange phenomenon layered on top of a finished, sealed text. They are the latest instance of something Tolkien's own writing has always steadily encouraged, an audience picking up the threads he deliberately left loose and doing something with them. Before we close out entirely, let me turn to what has actually been happening on the ground in New Zealand while all of that theorising goes on online, because I think the physical, unglamorous reality of the production tells you something the trailers and the casting announcements do not. Pre-production gradually began as early as September of 2025 in Wellington, which is nearly a full year before the widely reported milestone of filming actually starting in July of 2026. Location work during that stretch reportedly made use of the actual, still standing Hobbiton set out in Waikato, the same physical film set tourists have been able to visit for years, alongside additional scouting trips out to Hawke's Bay, rather than building an entirely new set of locations from scratch. This production, principal photography itself, began in July of 2026, based in Wellington, using Stone Street Studios and the Waiter Workshop facilities, the exact same physical infrastructure that produced the original trilogy more than 2 decades earlier. Reporting has largely framed this as a deliberate homecoming, a conscious choice to return the production to its actual point of origin. After the franchise's more recent output, including the animated War of the Rohirrim prequel, had drifted further from that direct New Zealand pipeline. The cinematographer on the new film is James Friend, an Academy Award winner for his work on All Quiet on the Western Front in 2022, which is a nice, if probably coincidental, echo of the same World War imagery Tolkien himself drew on for the Dead Marshes we talked about earlier. The first actual footage from the production reached the public at CinemaCon in 2026, and it is worth knowing exactly what that footage was, because it was deliberately not story footage at all. What screened was a behind-the-scenes mood piece. Andy Serkis shown in his motion capture suit on set, dropping into Gollum's familiar spider-like crouch and feral snarl, intercut with sweeping drone shots of New Zealand's mountains. No plot, no dialogue, no cast interaction, just texture and tone, which tells you something about how carefully the marketing is being managed at this early stage, favouring atmosphere over any actual reveal of story content. And I do want to address directly a question I suspect a fair number of you have been quietly wondering about throughout tonight's video, which is simply, how old is Andy Serkis now? And what does that mean for how he can actually play this role again? Serkis was born in April of 1964, which put him somewhere in his early 60s during the bulk of 2026, roughly a quarter of a century older than he was when he first originated this exact character. According to his own statements, reported across several outlets in the middle of that year, artificial intelligence and machine learning tools are being used on this production, but specifically and only to de-age the returning human cast members, McKellen, Wood and Pace, to match this earlier point in the timeline. That technology is explicitly not being used to alter or de-age Serkis's own performance capture work. He is still performing Gollum the traditional way, live physically, on location, wearing tracking dots, rather than relying on any digital youth effect layered over his own movement. If that holds true once the finished film actually exists, it means the single most digitally famous character in this entire franchise is, somewhat ironically, the one performer whose work on this production is being kept stubbornly, defiantly analogue. There is one last, small, slightly cheeky piece of trivia I want to leave you with before we properly wind down tonight, because I think it says something rather charming about how this franchise has always operated, well before this new film ever entered the picture. All three of the original trilogy films carry imagery that more than one critic, looking back with fresh eyes, has flagged as something that would almost certainly be rated R in another era, or under a stricter ratings board. Severed orc heads catapulted over the walls into Minas Tirith, corpses floating just beneath the surface of the dead marshes, Shelob's attack on Frodo, which is frankly quite harrowing for a film aimed at a general family audience, and yet Jackson, a director who cut his teeth, making gleeful, splatter-heavy horror comedies early in his career, secured a PG-13 rating across the entire trilogy, with no reported instance of the ratings board forcing him to trim or soften anything. He pushed that rating right up to its absolute edge, rather than being cut down to fit inside it, which strikes me as a rather perfect encapsulation of how this whole franchise tends to operate, taking material that is, underneath the fantasy trappings, truly dark and really adult, and finding a way to present it that still lets a much wider audience in the door. There is one more piece of genuine, reported controversy around this film that I have been holding off on, mostly because I wanted to set it apart, rather than folding it in alongside the casting trivia earlier, and I think it deserves that space, since it is not really a fun theory in the way the Marigold or Seren speculation was. It is a real criticism, aimed at a real decision, and I would rather think through it honestly than skip past it. The principal cast confirmed for this film, the named roles we walked through earlier: McKellen, Wood, Pace, Serkis, Dornan, Winslet, Taylor-Joy, Woodall, is entirely white. BBC News asked Andy Serkis about this directly, and to his credit, he did not dodge the question. Yes, there have been criticisms, he acknowledged. His stated position, as reported, is that the film will not pursue what he called a politically correct, just casting for the sake of casting and ticking boxes version, and that casting choices on this production are being made, in his words, only where relevant. I want to present that plainly and let it sit there as exactly what it is, a real statement from the director in response to a real, ongoing criticism, rather than either defending it further on his behalf or piling additional judgment on top of it. Reasonable people are quite obviously going to land in very different places on how satisfying or unsatisfying that answer actually is, and I do not think it is my job in a video like this one to tell you which of those reactions is the correct one to have. What I will say, because it strikes me as a rather interesting tension rather than a simple gotcha, is that this criticism lands with particular weight given something we already talked about earlier tonight. Marigold, Seren, and Halvard, the three entirely new characters this production had complete creative freedom to build from absolutely nothing, since none of them exist anywhere in Tolkien's own writing, are also part of that same all-white principal cast. Unlike Aragorn or Gandalf or Frodo, characters whose established book descriptions a studio might reasonably feel constrained by, these three roles actually came with no prior canon attached to them at all. Whatever casting philosophy shaped those three particular decisions, it was not one dictated by needing to match an existing physical description from the text, because no such description exists. I raise that not to hand you a verdict, but because it is the specific detail that makes this a slightly more complicated conversation than it might first appear, and it seems worth knowing plainly, rather than glossing over, on the way to something cosier. Before I let this settle into an ending, there is a slightly different flavour of theory I want to get to, distinct from the ones we have already covered, because so far, most of what I have given you has been theories about people, who Marigold really is, who Seren might secretly be. There is a whole other layer of fan speculation out there that is less about identity and more about shape, about what a 2-hour film built from 2 paragraphs of text is actually going to spend its time doing, scene by scene, and it deserves a slower pass before we close out entirely. The obvious structural question, and the one I see fans circling most often, is simply which parts of that thin, scattered source material get expanded into full scenes and which get left as backstory mentioned in passing. Does the 900-mile forced march from the dead marshes to Mirkwood become the actual spine of the film? An extended, grueling journey sequence, carrying most of the runtime, the way Aragorn himself describes it as the hardest trek of his life? Or does the production compress that march into a handful of scenes and spend its real time instead on the psychological material at either end of it? The torture and interrogation inside Mordor before Aragorn ever arrives, and the escape from Mirkwood afterward. My own honest guess, and I want to flag clearly that this is me speculating rather than reporting anything confirmed, is that a production explicitly describing itself as a psychological, interior story is more likely to lean toward the second option, treating the physical journey as connective tissue between two much more charged, emotional set pieces, rather than making the walking itself the main event. But that is a guess built on the language producers have used in interviews, not on anything resembling a leaked script page. There is also a real open question, entirely unaddressed by anything I could find in researching tonight's video, about whether Sauron himself appears in any form on screen. It is worth remembering, if you have not thought about it in a while, that by this point in the timeline, Sauron has no fair or physical body left to speak of. He lost that capacity long before these events, back when Menor was destroyed, and by the Third Age, he exists as something closer to a menacing presence, a will, an eye, shadow, rather than a walking figure you could put an actor in front of a camera to portray directly. Any Sauron material in this new film would almost certainly follow the same visual convention the original trilogy already established: the eye, the shadow, a voice without a face attached to it, rather than introducing some new embodied version of the character. I want to be clear that this is a reasonable inference, built on both the books and on established filmmaking precedent within this exact franchise, not a confirmed choice from anyone actually making the movie. But it does mean that even if the torture sequence in Bordior we talked about earlier does make it to screen, whoever is shown doing the actual interrogating is far more likely to be a Nazgul or some other lieutenant than Sauron himself in any recognisable form. And then there are the smaller, more practical theories, the kind that tend to circulate in fan forums rather than entertainment press, about things like runtime and rating. Given the PG-13 tradition we talked about a little earlier, and given how dark this particular slice of the story actually is, even by the trilogy's own standards, torture, murder, a 5-century-long descent into isolation and ruin, there is a reasonable amount of fan chatter wondering whether this film might finally be the one to push past that rating into something harder-edged, particularly if the Barad dock sequence is dramatised with any real weight. I would not bet heavily on that one either way. Every other film in this franchise has found a way to sit right at the edge of PG-13 without crossing it, and I suspect the commercial incentive to keep this one accessible to the widest possible audience is at least as strong here as it was for any of the earlier films, whatever the material itself might seem to invite. There is one more structural question worth raising, and it concerns Elijah Wood's confirmed return as Frodo, which on its surface sounds like a strange casting choice for a story that, chronologically, happens years before Frodo ever leaves the Shire with the ring at all. The film sits mostly within that 17-year gap between Bilbo's party and Frodo's own departure. The way Boynes has described it, Frodo's actual role in most of the events we spent tonight walking through, Gandalf's suspicion, Aragorn's hunt, the imprisonment in Mirkwood, would necessarily be small to the point of nearly non-existent, since he spends that entire stretch simply living an ordinary, unaware life back in the Shire. Fan speculation here tends to split two ways. One theory holds that Frodo's presence is mostly a framing device, a handful of scenes bookending the main action, perhaps Gandalf visiting Bag End at points along the timeline, checking in on a hobbit and a ring he is not yet ready to fully explain his suspicions about. The other holds that the film might use Frodo more sparingly still, largely as a closing gesture, a final scene that hands the story directly off into the opening of the trilogy audiences already know, Gollum's escape from Mirkwood, landing with extra weight, because we already understand even if Frodo does not yet, exactly what that escape is about to set in motion for him personally. Neither reading fits comfortably within what has actually been confirmed, and neither one is confirmed itself. I only raise it because it strikes me as a nice, quiet example of how even a returning, extremely familiar face can still generate genuine uncertainty once you place him inside a timeline where his usual story has not started yet. I think the honest summary of this whole layer of speculation, the shape theories, rather than the identity theories, is that almost none of it can be confirmed or denied yet, and that is plainly fine. It is the natural result of handing a devoted, detail-obsessed fan base only a title, a handful of cast names, and a couple of quotes about tone, more than a year before the thing itself actually exists. People fill silence with pattern, given enough time and enough source material to work from, and Tolkien, as we talked about earlier, left an unusual amount of both. So that is the lot, more or less. That is everything I have for you tonight. The whole business of it. The book and the film and the rumour mill sitting in between the two. I do not have a tidy moral to hand you on the way out, and I would be a little suspicious of myself if I tried to invent one just to give tonight's video a neater ending. I do not think there is a single clean lesson sitting underneath a story about a hobbit who strangled his best friend for a ring, wasted alone in the dark for nearly 5 centuries, was tortured by the nearest thing this world has to pure evil, escaped that, was hunted down by a tired, decent man doing a job nobody thanked him for, escaped again through no fault or cunning of his own, and eventually, almost by accident, ended up being the one creature whose presence saved the entire world at the exact moment the story's actual hero could not bring himself to finish the job. If there is a shape to that, it is not a moral, so much as a kind of stubborn, quiet insistence that mercy shown early as a way of paying itself back later, in forms nobody could have predicted at the time, and that even someone as ruined and compromised as anyone in the room might still, somehow, matter enormously before the story is over. I think that is closer to why this particular character keeps getting revisited, film after film, decade after decade, than any simple villain or hero framing ever could explain. Gollum is not really the monster of this story. He is its most persistent proof that nobody in it is only one thing, and that, I think, is honestly the real reason a 39-minute film shot for £3,000 by a volunteer crew, who mostly were not paid at all, could sit online for 15 years and gather 13 million views, with no marketing budget behind it whatsoever. Nobody made that film because they thought it would be profitable. Nobody watched it because the studio told them to. People kept coming back to it, unobtrusively, for over a decade, because the character at its centre, however roughly rendered on a budget that size, still carried enough weight to be worth the trouble. That is not so different, if you squint a little, from what a studio with considerably more than £3,000 is now betting an enormous, unusually complicated production on. That this same small, wretched, murderous, oddly sympathetic creature is still worth 2 hours of a much bigger budget's worth of attention, nearly 90 years after Tolkien first wrote him crouched by a pool of black water under a mountain, playing riddles for his life. There is more of this I want to get to eventually, more from this particular corner of Middle-earth that this video simply did not have room for tonight, and I suspect once the actual film exists, and I can talk about what it does, rather than only what it might do, there will be a great deal more worth saying about it. But that is for another night, whenever it comes. For now, though, it is very late, wherever you actually are, and I have kept you here rather longer than either of us probably intended when this started. If you are still awake at all, which I rather doubt at this point, thank you for letting me ramble through several centuries of Hobbit history and roughly 6 decades of corporate rights disputes at this particular hour. If you went under somewhere back there, good that really was the idea all along. Sleep well,